makes a nation a nation? A flag? An army? A parliament with democratic elections? And peaceful transfers of power? Or a proven track record of peace and stability? If that is the case, then Somaliland is a nation. And yet, this is a nation that does not officially exist. You won't find it in official maps. It does not have a seat at the United Nations, even though governments all over the world cooperate with it. This is the story of how Somaliland gained its freedom from British rule in 1960 by mutual agreement, and then gave up that independence to join a union with Somalia.
Since the union, we felt that we were deceived.
It was a failed union, which led to persecution and attempted genocide of Somaliland's people, and a savage war in which Somaliland once again had to gain its freedom.
A long civil war of 11 years, where a quarter of a million of our people were killed.
On May the 18th, 1991, Somaliland declared its independence once again. But it was not recognized by the rest of the world. This is the story of Somaliland's search for a rebirth as a democratic, independent nation-state.
What I would say to Somali nationalists who always want one Somalia, you've got to do better than Somaliland. You can't expect to drag Somaliland down to your level.
It is the story of how Somaliland went from almost complete destruction in a war to free itself from the Somali dictator Siad Barre to this. Somaliland has risen from the ashes and now sees itself as a start-up nation.
If you had been in Hargeisa 10 years ago, you could see the difference without even getting any statistics. You could actually just tell by how the city is transforming, what kind of businesses are running, the way people are looking, the cars people are driving. So you could see that the economy is growing and it's a place that's developing quite fast.
Somaliland is positioning itself not just as a stable democracy, but as the entrepreneurial and free market hub of the Horn of Africa.
So if Coca-Cola can do it here, anybody else can do it. Somaliland is open for business, and it's a force in the Horn of Africa. It's a force to be reckoned with in the future, economically.
Somaliland stands on one of the most strategic commercial sea lanes in the world. It's why many people around the world feel that after 30 years, it's within touching distance of realizing its dream of being its own nation for a second time. Say the word Somaliland, and it's most likely that you wouldn't think of this. A country secure and stable enough where money changers keep their thousands of dollars of local currency on the street side without any fear or worry. You wouldn't think of a country where there's been only one terrorist incident in 30 years, a far better record than even countries like France and the United States. And you probably wouldn't think that it's a place where foreigners live and work freely, without needing an armed escort.
I always smile when someone says, well, how safe do you feel? I think anybody on our team, and there are now 34 of us here at the school, any single person on that team would tell you that we feel safer here than we do in almost any other place.
I don't think security is an issue at all here. Right? It's safe to operate. It's safe to do business here. Not one of us have ever felt that we were in danger in any way. And we've had nothing but really but smiles and welcomes from all the Somalilanders.
What you're more likely to think of is this: the tragedy of Somalia.
With helicopter gunships riding escort, the army wagons ran the gauntlet through the ruins of downtown Mogadishu.
For 3 decades, ever since the US military intervention in the midst of a famine in 1991, Somalia has seen multiple foreign military interventions. Tens of thousands of troops, not just from America and other Western nations, but from the African Union, the United Nations, Ethiopia, and Turkey. All competed to bring stability and peace to Somalia. All have failed. And Somalia continues to be in the grip of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab, which attacks at will and controls more territory than the Somali government.
I've never seen anything like the devastation in Mogadishu. It looked exactly like the aftermath of Hiroshima. Totally devastated. And indeed, while I was in the Villa Somalia talking to the president, there was heavy machine gun fire right outside the window. And that was such a normal event in Mogadishu that no one turned a hair apart from the protection people. Somaliland was completely different in every way. I mean, first of all, there was good democratic order. And I spent time in Hargeisa. I went on a bus through the streets there. So, you know, Somaliland is a very different kettle of fish from the rest of Somalia.
Somaliland is a bit of a surprise to most people, because when they think of Somalia, and they often put Somaliland as part of Somalia, they think of all these apocalyptic stereotypes like war, 30 years of war in fact, famine, drought, pirates, all these sorts of labels. And then Somaliland is a place which, in fact, for the past more than 30 years has been pretty much peaceful. It's gone off on its own. It might not be recognized as an independent country by the rest of the world, but it certainly acts like one.
Somaliland in the north, with its capital Hargeisa, and the rest of Somalia, with its capital Mogadishu, are 2 separate countries now. But they were also separate countries when they were first created. But what are the factors that have made Somaliland stable, peaceful, and democratic compared to its neighbour? The story begins with their colonial legacies.
Very hot and very dry. That's the British Protectorate of Somaliland.
حقا Somaliland إنجليزكم. horta marka hore Ingiriisku dan badan kama hayso Somaliland. Muhiimadda weyn waxay markii Suez kala fara cadan ayaa isaga important u ahayd. Oo u degay marka cadan oo dhisantay oo facilitation-kii dekadii maraakiibtiisa iyo ciidamada isku hakanay markay u socdaan India iyo Indo-China bariga fog ayaa wax u baahday Somaliland.
A royal visit to this country is a rare event, and it was obvious that the youngsters in particular were out to make the most of it. During his tour, the Duke of Gloucester brought a special message of greetings from the Queen to the Somali people.
President Musa Bihi was a young boy during that royal visit to Somaliland in 1958, and he remembers it well.
laakiin waxaan garanayaa xaflad calanka Ingiriiska oo la qaado marka dadku waa xaflad cajiib la diyaarinayay eventku ugu weyn aan arkay dawladeed maanta horta xiiso lahayd inkastoo haraad ugu diray wadadii oo in badan taagnayn waxaana iyagoo yaacaynu dhaafeen baa horta waxa maana arag caruur xirka laakiin waxa la keenay bariga event aan dib ugu soo noqon Somaliland aan dib u arag pride kale.
In Somaliland, as in the rest of its empire, the policy of indirect rule set Britain apart from other European powers and came to define why it was so successful above others. Rather than recreating full British control of the nations they ruled and their cultures, they instead left local systems of governance, customs and traditional rulers and governed through them.
Some people call it rule with a light touch. It doesn't dismantle the social structures. It used them to rule the country. I remember when I was a kid, I'm going to school in 1956, the British were using the sultans to govern with them. They were there when I was being admitted to school to see how the process is smooth, there are no irregularities.
The colonial experience of Somaliland was very different from Somalia. There's no question of that. It's always hard to sort of pin down why are things like they are now. But in Somaliland, there was a sort of benign neglect. In comparison, the Italians were much more active colonizers, and they saw Italian Somaliland, as it was called, as the basis for the Italian East African Empire. That was really explicitly what they wanted it to be, and they wanted to settle lots of Italians there. They wanted to grow lots of bananas. They wanted to reorganize the way that the land system was operated. Those really had huge social impacts.
The contrast between Somaliland and Somalia was that in Somalia, the British guys or the white guys in the country never exceeded more than 200-300 people. But down there you had a settler community, or ran about 20-25,000. They dominated everything. The best schools, the best roads, the best banana plantations, the best business. So the colony was being run for their benefit, not for the benefit of Somali people. And here we had only not more than 300 people at the time, at any time, including the police and the military officers. So that's the contrast.
During that Italian era, the Italians had systematically dismantled this traditional clan system. And they did so because they wanted their Italian system to take over. The British, because of this light touch protectorate approach they had, used that system. The British didn't dismantle it, they saw the attributes in it and they turned it to their advantage and made those elders accountable to them, the British. So it wasn't a formal colonization process at all. It was an arrangement of mutual benefit.
Hamish Wilson's family has long connections with Somaliland. His father won a Victoria Cross, fighting alongside his colleagues of the Somaliland Camel Corps against Mussolini's fascist forces.
My father was serving in the King's African Rifles and later became commanding officer in the Camel Corps. But as soon as he arrived, he discovered actually, oh, the Somalis, these are very interesting people, and this is a very unusual country. And my father was probably fairly typical of the sort of people that in the British government who ended up there, because they were usually quite well educated, a little eccentric, not really fitting the sort of the normal mold. And he felt completely at ease amongst the Somalis. And he was shocked to discover there was really no more than a couple of dozen white administrators and officers in charge of the whole of Somaliland.
Almost as soon as British Somaliland joined with Italian Somalia, it was clear that their union was an ill-advised one. On the 26th of June, 1960, Somaliland won its independence during what became known as the Winds of Change in Africa, as Britain began relinquishing its colonies. 5 days later, Somalia won its independence from Italy. Such was the populist euphoria of independence in both countries at the time, Somaliland, a sovereign and recognized independent nation state, for just 5 days, decided to voluntarily merge with its neighbor in a new Somali republic. It was a fatal decision, and at the time the British government warned Somaliland not to go ahead with the union with Somalia.
With hindsight, it was a good advice. At least we would have waited 2-3 elections within Somaliland. It was some people call it a hasty marriage, and hasty marriage is always end in divorce all the time.
Some unions work, some partnerships work, some don't. Some marriages work, some don't. The partnership worked very much at a disadvantage for the people of Somaliland. The people of Somaliland decided to get out of that union.
Somaliland and Somalia have been left two very different and almost irreconcilable colonial legacies that would indeed make this a hasty marriage that would end in a bitter divorce. In Somaliland, Britain left intact the bones of an empowered society of traders, administrators and judges under a system of the rule of law, a lasting legacy which has sustained Somaliland ever since.
The British did firmly believe in establishing a fair system of justice and also an exemplary education system. What they did manage to do was create these 3 boarding schools that Amud, Sheikh and Deha. And these turned out a generation of highly educated Somalis. And the education they received was second to none. It was exactly the same syllabus as were being sat in Britain itself, and to the same level. In fact, the exams were marked in the UK.
I remember even in schools we used to learn about John Stuart Mill. We used to learn about John Locke. Yeah. And the argument is between John Locke and Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, that all people are created, that government should come from the consent of the government, of the governed. All that accumulated together to form the intellectuals and the elders and the people of Somaliland in a commonality that they understand that that's the only way that we could live with each other, and that's the only way that's for the future.
Within the first few years of union, when the capital of the new Republic of Somalia was based in Mogadishu, the disadvantages of union started to become clear to those from the north, the former Somaliland, as power, patronage and jobs were centered in the former Italian Somalia.
wadadku ay daalay yiro waxa laga daalay baasaboorka waxa doonaysa xamar laysanka waxa doonaysa xamar shaqada waxa doonaysa xamar tasiyaad bare iyo rajibkiisi isagu markuu soo eego reewqooyga wuxuu u qabaa niman mar walba aan la heshiin karin waayo wuxuu u qabaa in dadka ilbaxsiin.
In 1969, a military coup brought to power the dictator General Siad Barre. It began decades of repression. He was immediately suspicious of Somalilanders who dominated trade and business, because Italian colonial authorities had never allowed Somali businesses to thrive under their rule.
Well, being from Somaliland, the Siad Barre regime targeted the Somaliland people right from the start. In 1969, when the coup took place, the prime minister, the incumbent prime minister, was from Somaliland at that time, and he was jailed with others.
In 1969, Edna Aden was married to Ibrahim Ergal, who was the prime minister of Somalia that Siad Barre overthrew. Even though he was himself from Somaliland, Ergal had originally believed that union with Somalia would lead to benefits for both nations.
Somaliland gained its independence in 60 because people like Mohammed Ibrahim Ergal, my first husband and our late president, was one of the people who engineered that. That brutal military coup happened in 1969, which is when the government headed by Mohammed Ibrahim Ergal, the civilian democratically elected government, was ousted by the Marxist regime of Siad Barre. And it remains the last democratically elected government in Somalia.
Mahmoud Tani argues Somaliland's elites were tied to a political culture based on the liberal ideals of British thinkers like John Locke, whilst the elites in the south were left a political system built by a fascist ruler.
Most of the political elite in the south knew government as the government of Mussolini. Siad Barre was a fascist ruler, yeah. He directed his fascism against everybody in Somalia. But as Hitler directed more against the Jewish people, there were certain targets that Siad Barre was targeting more than the other people. It was a policy of extermination.
Hamish Wilson was a unique eyewitness to the state of fear imposed on Somaliland In 1984, he managed to get permission to cycle from Mogadishu to Hargeisa.
When you reached the area which is now Somaliland, the northwest, that there was this sinister sense of oppression. In villages, for example, there would be raids on people's houses. Women and children would be taken away and imprisoned, or worse, they would be shot or raped or never heard of again, under the accusation that their husband or their brother or their father was a member of the Somali national movement and was somewhere off in the bush fighting against the government. Then you found there were restrictions on where people could move their livestock. And then when you reached the towns, you talked to the business community. They were not granted letters of credit in order for them to do business, to trade. If they needed any form of documentation, many times they would have to travel to Mogadishu, which is thousands of kilometers away and very expensive to reach. The telephone system didn't work. The post system didn't work. The schools were underfunded or being closed. The hospitals had no medicines in them. And then you found there was this sort of subversion of the religious ethics. There was a very strong tradition of Sufism, of Islamic philosophy in the northwest. That was being suppressed. You then found that the young girls would often be invited in all innocence to government events, only to find themselves being compromised in, either sexually or under accusations of that, and then they would be blackmailed and turned against. So there was this sort of very subversive fear, and everyone was living in fear.
On April 6, 1981, the Somali National Movement, or SNM, was formed with the sole purpose of breaking the Siad Barre regime's control over Somaliland and reasserting the country's independence. It would take nearly a decade of savage fighting, nearly 250,000 dead, and many more driven into exile before this would be achieved.
But during the recent offensive, we have taken over most of the urban centers.
The SNM did not have a foreign power to sponsor its war, so the financing and support of the movement came from Somaliland diaspora communities all over the world. Hamish Wilson spent the majority of the war with the SNM forces, reporting for international news organisations.
The SNM was, I would call it, a subscription liberation army. They were probably the only liberation army that certainly I can ever think of in the world that was not officially backed by any foreign state or government. They were essentially supported by members of the extended clans that comprised the SNM. Virtually none of them were professional soldiers or had ever received any military training. There were tea shop owners, there were teachers, there were business people from the used to sell clothes in the market, or just random civilian people. And they were all there for the simple reason they were fighting for their freedom.
Siad Barre specifically targeted civilians because it was only by punishing the civilians that supported them that he could defeat the SNM. President Musa Bihi was a senior military commander of the SNM. Throughout the war, he never left the front line around the capital Hargeisa and witnessed its brutal destruction.
horta Hargeysa waa joogeen state waan soo galay maalmihii u dambeysana anoo dhaawac la iga saaray haddana maan fogeyn halkan maan joogay 7 kilomitir barra magaalada kama fogeyn 3 sano dusha laga dagaalamayay kama jiidan uma ku jiray magaalada Hargeysa markaa magaalada waxay ku sugan tahay iyo baabaeeda qofku u dambeeyay ka tagay markii la garaacayay dhex fadhiyay baa tusaale ku soo magaalada waxay ku dhacay for the record markaa maxaa lagu dalbaday waxaa lagu dalbaday 2 diyaaradood oo maalintii isu wadaarta markaa maalintii ugu yaraan 4 saacadood bay garaacay laba waxa la soo safay oo buurtaa la soo saaray halka taliska ciidanka agtiisa ilaa dhowr iyo 30 qori oo kala duwan oo madaafiic tirada dheer raasheer ma soo 120 hawsar 60 magaalada lagu soo jeediyey centerkeeda dhimashada habeenkii iyo dhaawacan uu qaadi jiray habeenkaan u yarahay 20-30 dhimasho ah oo shiciba maaha askarta ciidanka meydka lasoo ururiya laga helo ilaa 100 iyo dheeraad dhaawac ah oo shiciba oo odayaal leh markaan soo noqonay waxaanu u nimid intii magaalada taagneed la sii dumiyey iyo saqafyadoo la furtay oo la gurtay oo ciidankiisa bar magaalada oon lahayn biyo oo aan lahayn station police oo aan meel wax laga cunaa furayn oo doox engege yahay ayaa ciidankana soo galay qaxootigina markiiba ka soo daba dhacay.
The SNM's military wing was governed by its political leadership, and throughout the war, the civilian leadership of the SNM wanted to ensure that it laid the basis for democracy by practicing democracy itself.
SNM waxay jabhad 10 sano soo dagaalamayay. waxaana lahayd leadership siyaasi mar walba. marnaba ciidamadu may hogaamin SNM. taa horta maan ku hay. waxa lagu aasaasay hab siyaasi ah. markaa waxa siyaasiin da'weyn oo waay araga oo aqoon leh ayaa mar walba jira waayay. waxa lagu caayarayaa waxay qolaan aan deganaysaa 5 jeer bay madaxweynayaashu diray. taasi waana dhanna waa ka negative oo degdeg badaan u daayay marar kale laakiin waxay xalinaysaa mushkiladda isaysiga conflict buuqa badan dadkii waxa kala jaadan wadaad shuuci dimuqraadi mid geejiro waxa garanay dadkaas meesha wada dagaalamay marka waxaan u soo baranay dawlad isbedesha wada shaqeysa oo heraarka yar.
The SNM's decision to elect its civilian leaders even whilst its armed forces fought the Somali dictator was driven by a fundamental principle by which Somalilanders had governed themselves and dealt with others back to the times of British colonial rule. It was based on deliberation amongst clans and, more importantly, on the need to do deals, to come to an agreement that worked for everyone, amongst themselves and with others.
The SNM was a democratic organization. They used a democratic culture. 5 times the leadership was changed within the SNM while they had no country, while they were fighting, while they were in straitened circumstances. Among a sea of dictatorships, they succeeded to practice democracy. That was one thing that made them possible to unite the people under a banner of everybody has got the same rights.
And once the troops of Siad Barre were ousted from the territory of the former British Somaliland Protectorate, the people of Somaliland closed that border where the British had left it, began to demine the country, rebuild the country, put roofs back on dwellings, bring up people back from refugee camps, reunite family members who were dispersed and lost. And once that happened, then we went on to the task of nation building.
After the defeat of their common enemy, Siad Barre, Somaliland's factions began to turn on themselves.
Not everybody was a supporter of the SNM. There were forces outside the main Isaac area who were supporting the government.
The SNM had a choice: take power as the victor or turn to the fundamental principle on which Somaliland's governance had been built, making a deal.
SNM did not force itself on these people. It collected them in a clan conference and asked, where do we go from here? The decision to cede from Somalia didn't come from the SNM. It came from the elders who were gathered in there, who decided enough is enough. And SNM was on board at that time, but it was not the main mover of going it alone.
And I think at the end of the conflict, it was very significant that they realized very quickly that in order to establish a kind of sustainable stability, once the civil war in the north had finished, it was just starting in the south, but in the north had finished, they realized that they would have to reach out to those clans that were situated within the old British protectorate borders, but were not part of the SNM. And I think that was a really, really critical moment.
The SNM did something that was unique in modern Africa. They were an armed liberation movement that won power, but instead voted to lay down its guns, demobilize, and hand power to a civilian leadership that would decide the future of the country. It was a reconciliation process known as the Boroma Conference. Hamish Wilson was one of the only outsiders to have witnessed and recorded the whole of the Boroma Conference.
Now, the Boroma meeting is in many ways, in my opinion, I think it's the greatest achievement in the modern history of the Somali nation, of the Somali people, and one of the greatest achievements in the modern history of Africa, I'd go so far as to say. Because what they managed to do, they managed to bring people from every group or vestige interest in the future of Somaliland. They've managed to bring them together to the one city in Somaliland which was largely unaffected by the war, which is Boroma. And they, for 4 months, sat down and debated the future of Somaliland. It wasn't so much concerned with discussing the past or what had happened. There was no soul searching about who did this and who did that and what was right and what was wrong. It was all about the future. And they modelled this meeting on the finest tradition of what I call pastoral democracy, which has derived from the nomadic system of what the Somalis call her, this traditional law. So it went on for 4 months for the very reason that there is an old saying or an old belief in Somali society that every adult should have the right to stand up and be heard, be listened to, and that is precisely what happened. They all came and spoke their mind and debated what they wanted as a society for the future of this land that they then called Somaliland.
I mean, the fact of the matter is what happened in Boroma, what happened in Barao with the various conferences, it really established a model which, frankly, should be a model for other regions and other countries in Africa. The fact of the matter is you had a broad compact. The business community, the political community came to an understanding that chaos that was happening in the rest of Somalia wasn't in the interest of anyone.
And I think the cumulative effect of all of those negotiations were that they ended up with what has turned out to be not undisputed, but quite a robust kind of settlement for Somaliland. And that's really what Somaliland's built on.
I mean, frankly, while the economy of Somaliland might lag behind other countries simply because of the lack of recognition, when it comes to democracy, it shouldn't be compared to Africa. It should be compared to many different states in Europe, Asia, and so forth, which have much more established democratic track records.
This picture captures another crucial milestone of the Boroma Conference. The military leader of the SNM, Abdi Rahman Ali Tour, is congratulated as he succeeded as president by a civilian, Mohamed Agal.
The other thing that happened at that conference was that the SNM commander had become president, the top guy, and he had come to the conference hoping he would win again, and he lost. And the guy who won the presidency was a civilian. That was also really significant because that was the moment actually tangibly when power passed from the military command, to a civilian president.
This has been the lasting legacy of the Boroma Conference. Through its ancient custom of dialogue, negotiation and deal-making, Somaliland built a modern democratic system for the peaceful transfer of power under civilian rule, which has lasted to this day. But that system was severely tested in the presidential election of 2003, which brought Somaliland to the brink. The contest was between these two men, incumbent President Riale and opposition leader and former head of the SNM movement, Ahmed Silanya. The one-man, one-vote election saw over 500,000 ballots cast. Once every vote was counted, the incumbent President Riale had won by just 80 votes, a result opposition leader Silanya challenged. Could Somaliland's fragile democracy survive?
At that time I was the deputy speaker of the House, and the rest of the elders delegated me to go and meet with President Ahmed Silanya. I remember it was a very nerving thing. We met alone outside town. He voiced his concerns, we voiced our concerns, and the decision was that to leave it to the courts, even though he had no trust in the courts. His supporters, die-hard supporters, were advising him never to accept that.
أنا waxaan xisbiga kulmiyeenka u joogay tirada silaayo wuxuu yidhi waryaalaheen aan iska aqbalo intii la isku jabi lahaa anuu raggi diiday baan silaayo ka horreeyay dagaalan baan odhan waxaan ku yidhi doorashada lagu celiyo waa caddahay tan istax maahee anagu waxaan lahayn election khilaaf la qabto.
Let me take a swipe at my friend here now, Musa. I don't think he would have accepted that if he was at that time in Syria's place. That was a swipe at my friend.
anagu waxaan lahayn election khilaaf la qabto maba aqbali karo waa caddaan maya.
But I think the international community and the world knows that the role he played. He categorically said, Hargeisa won't have a green line where my forces control one part and the government controls one part.
runtii siraayana maalintaa isagu keligii wuxuu istaagay mar walba kolba cid ha raacdee war miska sii daynaa bu taagan xataa mar buu ayaa garay hadalka yidhi war aniga kursigayga lagu dagaalami maayo nabadda aanu qaadan.
He accepted to save the country. And actually, I'm witness to that. His surroundings, people who were surrounding him, all refused the issue. But he had the guts to overrule them and said, no way, we're not going back to the civil war of 1994.
boqolka badadku waxay u qaraan arday odayaasha halkaan soo dhigano ay xag dhaqan ka mareen 5 sano waxaa maahee aanu aqbalo dalku ha jiro.
Somaliland did endure. Its democracy proved resilient. Somaliland faced an existential crisis, a moment when it had to choose between civil war and reconciliation.
Being that close, 80 votes, well, anyone can contest 80 votes. There might be any number of reasons why you would find a few here and there. And so Selania really did have a lot of pressure on him to decide whether he was going to concede defeat or not. I'm not trying to paint him as some kind of saint. He wasn't. He was making a political decision. But he made a political decision which was important for Somaliland. Conceding that election at that moment and saying, okay, yep, it might be only 80 votes, but for the sake of Somaliland, I'm going to accept that. That was a huge moment.
It chose stability at such a moment because the indigenous institutions of governance, such as the clan elders, the business and intellectual leaders that had been protected during British rule, and the SNM's culture of democracy whilst fighting the Siad Barre regime, combined to save Somaliland when it faced that stark choice. Now came the task of rebuilding Somaliland.
I remember back in 1991 when I was here in Somaliland, there was no telecommunications here in Somaliland. You had to really travel to Ethiopia or go to Djibouti in order for you to make an international call.
In the first 10 or 15 years, it was tough because the whole country was destroyed. There were no homes, there were no roads, no schools, no universities. We spent our lives, especially in the first 2 decades, rebuilding the country, rebuilding the infrastructure, especially from the grassroots.
In the first 2 decades, there would be next to no aid. The country was unrecognized and overlooked by the international community. The generation that was born and grew up through those years want to forge a very different future for it.
I grew up with Somaliland. My age is more or less the same age of Somaliland. And it's not only me, there's another Somaliland young people who are, grew up with their country and now in a very good level. Maybe they're business people, maybe they're politicians like me. So my country, I believe my country, Somaliland, over me a lot. I have got peace where I can study. I have got a peace where I can have my normal life.
The generation today are working as hard as possible because once you build something good, you have to maintain it.
we depend on ourselves. We got to where we are on our own.
Somaliland aad bay isku bedeshay. Anu xagga ma ku dhashay marka waxaan garanayaa waddanka burbursan iskuuladeena oo markaan yaryarayn burbursanaa waxaan sameyn jirnay kuraasi iskuulka markii la qoray kuma fadhiisan jirin daasad baan ku fadhiisan jirnay laakiin marka carruurta yar hadda iskuulada tagtaa basas baa qaada kuraasi way helaan cunto fiican bay iskuulka ka dhex helaan anu iyaga waxaan xasuustaa iskuulka markaan dhigan jiray iskuulkayga xitaa suuli hablaha ma lahayn marka hadda markaan arko nolosha si isku bedelayso wallahi meel fiican bay maraysaa waanan arkaa isbedel maalin kasta soo kordhaya maalin kasta.
This is the remains of a technical college in the Somaliland capital Hargeisa shortly after the country's self-declared independence in 1991. There are many ways to measure a nation's progress, but this remarkable school on the outskirts of Hargeisa today gives a glimpse of how far Somaliland has come by itself, with virtually no international assistance or intervention.
I'm Trudy Hall, and I am delighted to be the headmaster at Abarso. I actually spent about 42 years in the United States in a career in education with degrees from Harvard and Duke.
Abarso School was established in 2009 by Jonathan Starr, a financier at a hedge fund on Wall Street, with an extraordinary and scarcely believable mission: to provide a world-class education in the middle of Somaliland, a country which doesn't exist, to students who had never seen the outside world and were mostly from impoverished backgrounds, to become the future leaders of Somaliland.
The idea is a wild one. The idea is that you bring over people who want to, from a service point of view, be here and educate these young men and women so that they can move on to go to colleges across the globe.
It's a co-educational boarding school, and its graduates have gained places at some of the best universities in the world: Harvard, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Georgetown, Amherst, the American University of Beirut, and much, much more.
Every day here they hear messages about you are to be a leader, you are to be proud of your country, you are to be equally as fluent in both Somali and in English, because if you are going to be the translators of your culture to the outside world, you must be able to speak and write in Somali and in English. We want you to be grounded here in an ethic of service. The expectation is what you are getting is so unusual in terms of the gift of an educational opportunity that it is your responsibility to give back first and foremost.
Over 30 young Americans have moved to live in Somaliland and teach at Abarso. In doing so, they are witness to the safety and stability Somaliland offers to foreigners from around the world, who form an increasingly large expat community.
Say my experience has been, nothing short of amazing. I've been welcomed with open arms by the people here. Even going out on like a 20-mile run, I'll, stumble upon, a nomadic group living in the middle of nowhere, and they'll ask me to come in and sit with them.
There is great hope for this part of Africa, for this corner of Africa. This is a stable corner of the world that is doing many things right now. And they're doing it through their own creative problem solving.
Abarso School provides a snapshot at how Hargeisa and the rest of Somaliland has become a diverse melting pot. Westerners, as well as communities from Kenya, Ethiopia, Yemen, Syria, and other parts of Somalia, have slowly begun to create a vibrant, open, and diverse cultural space and dialogue. One symbol of that is the National Library in Hargeisa, which was the brainchild of one man.
I am the original founder of the National Library, which we built through the fundraising from the Somaliland community all over the world, from UK, the Middle East, America. And we haven't asked any aid from any international NGO or international community. And we raised the funding for that library through ourselves. And that's the way we build in Somaliland. Thousands of young boys, girls and boys, they are visiting every week. And it's a place to socialize, a place they can educate themselves, a place to learn, and also we have a lot of debate and discussion about the social issue, political, and so on.
Another symbol of Somaliland's increasing openness is the Hargeisa Book Festival, now the largest literary festival in the whole of East Africa, attracting 20,000 visitors every year. Jama Musa Jama is its founder.
So we created this space to show that Somaliland is ready to welcome to the world. And the reason is just to see how these young people can appreciate their identity, their history, but most importantly share with the rest of the world where they are going to.
I'd expected a very conventional book fair, but this is so much more than that. It's culture, it's debate, it's current affairs. Somaliland is certainly, I've been absolutely amazed by how vibrant it is, how positive it is, how peaceful it is, how friendly the people are. I felt very, very comfortable here, and I'll certainly be back again next year.
Cultural diplomacy plays an important role to tell to the world that there is a place called Somaliland.
But cultural diplomacy and Somaliland's stability over the past 30 years has not brought it the one thing that it's wanted the most: international recognition. The rest of the world sees Somaliland as still being part of Somalia, where the UN and international powers have committed billions of dollars in aid and military assistance, something Somaliland has not seen nor sought.
Somaliland had very fortunate, has been very fortunate, in that has been neglected by the international community. The international community was focused on the disaster in the south, while we had to tinker in splendid isolation. That's what I call it.
You would have thought the UN would have been particularly interested in any grassroots indigenous attempt to solve their problems, to create what you might call now a roadmap for the future. But quite the opposite, because the UN was entirely focused on the concept of government in Mogadishu, and they believed that their plan for the future of Somalia was the only one.
Somalia has kind of suffered because there's been so much international intervention, which at times hasn't really helped it along the way, whereas Somaliland has done things very much on its own terms and built things much more from the bottom up.
All the successes that Somaliland had had in disarmament and demobilization, which they'd done without any outside intervention, was not being rewarded. Quite the opposite. The more insecure Mogadishu becomes or has become, the more money the international community puts into it. There's so much self-interest in the system not working because too many people are making money out of it not working.
But non-recognition has been immensely damaging to Somaliland on almost every level. Despite its self-made progress, it remains cut off from the international trading and banking system. Its citizens are unable to travel on their passports, and it's denied Somaliland access to every international organisation. It prevents Somaliland from playing a role in helping to bring the stability it enjoys to Somalia.
Well, the independence of Somaliland will help Somalia in many ways. To start with security. We have a shared security problem in this country. And if Somaliland was recognized, it would have been in a much stronger position to not only secure Somaliland, but also help secure Somalia. That's one way. The other way is, I think, politically. I think if Somaliland was recognized, Somaliland would have played a much stronger role in stabilizing Somalia itself. I mean, we know the culture, we know the people, unlike the international community, which has been trying to fix Somalia for the past 30 years, which haven't managed yet.
A lot of intellectuals and academics talk about international law, but even within the United Nations building, what really defines relationships between countries are interests. And here the stars are also coming into alignment for Somaliland. As Somalia heads back into failure and chaos, as Ethiopia teeters with civil war, the fact of the matter is that Somaliland is looking better and better, and the interests in the region are really coming into focus with regard to the Red Sea. So what better strategic asset could you have than Somaliland?
For nearly 3 decades, it seemed that Somaliland was stuck in a golden cage, with peace, stability, economic progress, and located in one of the most strategic parts of the world, but unable to join the international community. Somaliland just needed a spark to ignite its quest for independence. That spark came in May 2016.
Berbera is an interesting port, it's an old port, but we felt it is an opportunity. And a year and a half, we started to manage it and improve the services. And now we are confident that shipping line will come, so we are building the cables.
Global maritime logistics company DP World announced a nearly $500 million investment to upgrade and manage the port of Berbera in Somaliland. History had come full circle.
Berbera is ours again.
It was Berbera, a natural deep water port that drew the British Empire to Somaliland in the late 19th century. Now a rising regional power, the United Arab Emirates was drawn to Berbera, and Somaliland once again drew on its history of cooperation and deal-making to bring it about. But this was more than just an investment. This was a nation-building project in which Somaliland was treated as a de facto sovereign state. Landlocked Ethiopia, the regional superpower, needed Berbera and so became a co-shareholder in the port along with the Somaliland government. Furthermore, the United Arab Emirates Sovereign Wealth Fund agreed to build a new highway from Berbera to the Ethiopian border, known as the Berbera Corridor.
The investment of DP World, this massive investment that they've made in the port at Berbera, which does have huge potential but has kind of lain rather, not neglected because it's active because of livestock and other exports, but it's a pretty basic place. And now you've got this massive international company. So it is very significant and interesting that such a massive company was prepared to sign a deal with a territory that doesn't exist on the United Nations list of formal countries.
Ahmed Gele knows more than anyone how bringing a global company to invest in Somaliland can be a catalyst. He convinced Coca-Cola to build a plant here, and he was also partnered with Maersk Shipping Line and DHL in logistics. He believes the DP World investment will lead to a commercial chain reaction in Somaliland.
Somaliland is very lucky to have DP World operating in Berbera. It's a quality operator who operates in over 70 ports around the world, the #1 in the world. So we're very lucky to have them in Berbera working. Of course, we have to put the infrastructure in place. We have to put the roads. There'll have to be a railway, the free zone, and so on and so forth, a major airport. But all that, I think the first step is the port. Once we have a modern port, then I think the rest will all follow, it will fall into place.
It's one thing for a multinational to invest $500 million in Somaliland, but it's a vote of confidence on a much bigger scale when one individual says he's putting $500 million of his own money into Somaliland's human development. Ismail Ahmed is one of the leading fintech entrepreneurs in the world and voted the most influential Black Briton in 2019. He's from Somaliland and has launched a foundation towards the country.
I think the focus for Somaliland is to demonstrate to the rest of the world, particularly to Africa, that this is a unique success story, a success story built by Africans rather than something that was based on international aid. It is part of what we intend to do, to invest in the entrepreneurship ecosystems. That includes incubators, financing. What I'm planning to contribute is not only the financing, but more importantly, I think what I have learned over the last 10 years, particularly by building global tech companies and encouraging, the young people to, continue focusing on the private sector, so that we can build a private sector led economy.
But for a nation on a journey to join the international community, it needed a political investment to catch the eye in the way DP World's business investment did. That moment came in February 2020. After several years of quiet diplomacy and growing links, Taiwan and Somaliland signed a bilateral cooperation agreement, in effect recognizing each other.
Officials on Wednesday unveiled the plaque for Somaliland's representative office in Taiwan.
horta dee markaan si kooban kugu sheego annaga iyo Taiwan waxaan ahay danyara iskaashada laba dalo yar yaroo midna aan la ixtiraafsano mid waliba halgamayaan hayno marka danyara iskaashada horta isku dhib dalalka badanna dee way xidhan waa maxay dowladda yare ku dhiiratay inay China oo u caron doono hadday ictiraafto Taiwan.
We believe Somaliland and Taiwan has shared values, but the formal relationship building has taken for the last 2 years, and we were doing in a very confidential way, in a diplomatic way. We did not announce anything about our relationship unless we reach the final stage of signing the formal agreement. We know Taiwan has friends, particularly Europeans and US. Somaliland has also friends. As far as I know, US was on board our relationship, the relationship between Somaliland and Taiwan, and I think they have the endorsement. Taiwan has got the endorsement of the US to sign relationship agreement with Somaliland.
Proof that the United States was fully behind this strategic move came in this tweet by the White House National Security Council in July 2020.
American foreign policy tends to be much more reactive than proactive. What we need to do is wait for many more officials in Washington to understand we can't rely on Djibouti. Djibouti has basically become a colony of mainland China. We can't rely on Ethiopia. Ethiopia is landlocked and increasingly has become a colony of mainland China. So what really makes Somaliland special in the bulwark against China is it's a democracy. And China has trouble dealing with countries that are democracies.
Somaliland is now one of only 2 countries in Africa to recognize Taiwan instead of China. And this is Taipei's embassy in Hargeisa.
And Taiwan and Somaliland is standing shoulder to shoulder together to face the tough time. But we believe that tough time never lasts, but tough people do.
Alan Chenwa-Lo is Taiwan's ambassador to Somaliland. He sees the relationship as a win-win, but says Taiwan can be a diplomatic gateway to the world, particularly to the US, for Somaliland.
I always share with our Somaliland friends that the shortest way for Somaliland's nation building and independence is through Taiwan, because we are ahead of you. We are facing the similar challenges, but right now, if we can reach our goal, and I think you can also make it.
Ambassador Lo argues that the world needs to accept a simple reality, that like Taiwan, Somaliland does not need to prove its independence. It's simply seeking recognition.
There's no need to declare Taiwan is an independent country because we are independent. Likewise, Somaliland is independent. What you need to do is to bring more recognition from the international society and the nation building process. So Taiwan is together with you. Don't worry, you are together with Taiwan, you're together with the world, with the like-minded countries.
But despite all this, Somaliland remains technically a part of Somalia, a country which is still in the grip of almost daily violence and political upheaval. And in the run-up to Somaliland's 30th anniversary of self-declared independence, the situation in Somalia reached its most dangerous point for decades. In 2017, President Farmajo was elected indirectly by a process of elite negotiations to lead the government of Somalia, as it wasn't possible to hold one-man, one-vote elections. But in early 2021, instead of standing for re-election as planned, President Farmajo tried to extend his presidency by an extra 2 years. It led to protests and violent clashes between President Farmajo's forces and opposition groups. Somalia was beginning to look much like it did in the 1990s. It caused disbelief amongst Somalia's international partners, who'd spent billions propping up Somalia's government for 2 decades. Tibor Nagy, a career US diplomat focused on Africa for nearly 3 decades, was, until early 2021, the US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, overseeing US policy across the whole continent.
What's the definition of insanity? When you expect different consequences from the same actions? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the international community has been consistently fooled by Somalia. And this time, I have to say, we were fooled again, because lo and behold, President Farmajo wants to stay for another 2 years in power. You know, if I was making US policy towards Somalia right now, I would take a very, very strict look at what we need to do to cut back, number one, but also to reconsider how we treat Somaliland.
His call for a complete reassessment on policy towards Somalia and Somaliland comes after the process started at the London Conference on Somalia in 2012 now looks to have failed. Convened by the UK and attended by world leaders, international powers committed to supporting, promoting and backing the federal government of Somalia. Somaliland's President Ahmed Selanyo, who attended, urged the world not to disregard Somaliland's case.
We in Somaliland have been fighting to get the international community to accept our cause of standing on our own. We have been fighting for independence for a very, very long time, and we have established a stable government, a stable democratic government, peaceful in the region, and we are trying our level best to engage with the rest of the international community.
Despite President Selanyo's pleas, the world doubled down on a strategy of unifying Somalia and seeing Somaliland as part of it.
Under David Cameron's leadership, we had a big Somalia conference in London, which I organised, and it really was a time of great hope. And we basically said 4 things. There was a bargain to be had between the international community and Somalia in terms of their constitution from the top down, in terms of governance and accountability from the bottom up, and in terms of injecting systems, which meant that all the money that was raised through taxes, principally from the airport or the ports, wasn't stolen through corrupt acts, and also strengthening the forces of law and order through the African Union and through the contribution that Britain and America were making militarily.
But 10 years later, most British and American officials and analysts say that strategy failed and needs to be rewritten.
It was policy by wishful thinking, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, even something ridiculous like raising tax revenue. I hate to say it, but my understanding is that Al-Shabaab raises more tax revenue in Mogadishu than the Somali government.
British and other international powers recently have I think they're coming to realise that their investment in Somalia, it hasn't really paid that many dividends, and they're also, I think, coming to realise that they will not be able to defeat Al-Shabaab militarily.
We did make very good progress for the next few years, but alas, today that progress is in reverse. And it's a very great pity. The fact that Somalia is going backwards is not just a local issue, it's a big international issue, because it affects, pollutes and corrupts the region.
To me, it is blatantly ridiculous. It is based in no way on reality, and it desperately cries out for a dramatic reevaluation of U.S. government policy towards Somalia.
But British and American officials now believe it's no longer enough to change policy towards Somalia. The international community also has to drastically rethink its engagement with Somaliland?
Well, my position is we absolutely should look at some kind of a formal relationship with Somaliland because it is a state that works. I got to know the very first president when I was ambassador in Ethiopia, and he was beyond frustrated because he said, tell me again, Mr. Ambassador, that if I had a terrorism problem, then the United States would cooperate with me. Is that correct? I said, yes. But because I don't have a terrorism problem, the United States, so they don't get any foreign assistance. They are a stable, working nation, and they conduct elections. You know? So to me, it's a no-brainer, and they have a historical point to make.
That Somaliland is essentially a self-governing, independent nation. Of course, there's this difficult tie with Mogadishu and with all the corruption, the fighting, the blood, and the horrific things that go on there. And the sooner that is untied, the better, in my political opinion, because it can't help Somalia. It doesn't help Mogadishu. They won't listen to anything, globally or locally. And Somaliland, meanwhile, has forged straight ahead in a special way, and that deserves full international recognition.
The British Foreign Office basically said, we're in favour of Somaliland moving towards independence, so long as the African Union agree. And there is a very strong case for Somaliland going it on its own, having that independence. I mean, it restores it to the position it was in before, and also it honours the fact that it's doing so much better in every way than the rest of Somalia.
So, a few things there. First of all, Somalis have been governing themselves effectively for 1,000 years. So they're not ungovernable. But they've never taken to the nation state idea. That's the thing that has proven so difficult to consolidate. But that's also the thing that Somaliland's done that no one else has to the same extent in that region. So I think that's where Somaliland's sort of exceptionalism lies.
In some ways, an independent Somaliland is in the interest of all Somali peoples. It's a place where they can come and do business. It's a place where they can seek security. It's a place where they can trade with the outside world. It's a place where they can educate their children. So until all Somalis, wherever they live, see that it is actually in their personal and family's interest to have this country called Somaliland independent, where they can benefit from, that's the point, I think, at which the rest of the international community will also turn towards Somaliland and said, you're actually a solution to a lot of people's problems in the region and internationally.
The question of Somaliland, its independence, and the prospect that it might ever, there might ever be a time when Somaliland would see fit to rejoin the rest of former Somalia, I personally don't see so, certainly not in my lifetime. I can't tell in 50, 60 years' time the situation may change. But right now, I don't think you would stand a chance. Even if you were a politician active in Somaliland who, in the back of their head somewhere, believed that this might be some, good idea, the people would never let it happen.
I think that's absolutely right. I cannot see a situation where people in Somaliland will look at what's happening in the rest of Somalia now and say it is positively in our interest to join Somalia and be governed from a central government in Mogadishu. It doesn't speak to their security agenda. It doesn't speak to their prosperity agenda. Second to that is that Somaliland seems to be on an upward economic curve. This nation of deal makers are making deals with large international investors, and more will follow in power, infrastructure, and many other fields. But that's still not going to answer this question of recognition. Somaliland's been in this limbo for 30 years. And I think Somaliland has really missed over the last 30 years playing the very powerful set of cards that it has. It's all about a recognition that works for everyone, not just Somaliland, but the rest of Somalia, but also for the international community. I mean, the international community and the stakeholders in the Somali region are stuck. There's no other way of putting it. And I know that because I've spoken to the policymakers directly. They are tearing their hair out and they don't know which way else to turn. And part of their solution lies in what Somaliland has done.
But the one thing that Somalilanders need to keep in mind when it comes to their frustration with the United States is that famous quote by Winston Churchill. What Winston Churchill said when he was expressing frustration with the United States is the Americans always do the right thing. They just try everything else first. Well, we've tried everything else first, now it's time to do the right thing.
Somaliland soddon sano dee madax bannaan oo shaqaynaysa iyo ictiraaf beerina oo wanaagsan oo meel aan marsoon farxaya marna caalamku halku maray dib u dhaca Somaliland ku dhacay 60 sano u dambeeyay marka qiyaasana waan ka xumaa marka hadii laba filim baa soo noqday marka hadii adigu dan laga arko oo dan ninka doonaya ku xiraafa oo ka arko ku ictiraafay haduu ka waay muxuu ku faray Somaliland waxaad ka soo qaadaa yaa u dambeeyay la ictiraafay South Sudan yaa ugu dambeysay yaa waday Mareykanka muxuu waday petrol ku arkay China qaatu ka dhacsanay petrol baa laga helay waa la ilaashanaya waa dawladda dayma baa laga helay waa la ilaashanaya inaga macdan iyo dhulkeena iyo bad iyo bari waa barakeysan laakiin wali lama baarin oo interest material imka lagu waayo.
What Somaliland has achieved and how it maintains those achievements have endured. It now has all the makings of the most democratic, stable country in the Horn of Africa, with enormous economic potential. The question now is whether Somaliland can go from being Africa's startup nation to being Africa's next nation.